The flame is a beautiful liar. It promises light, it promises warmth, but in the heart of Rome, on a cold February morning, it promised only a screaming, final silence. They had stripped him of his robes, of his name, and of his hope, yet they could not touch the one thing they truly feared: his mind. He was a friar, a philosopher, a traveler of stars, but to the men in black, he was a poison that had to be burned away. For 8 long years, they tried to break his spirit with cold stone and iron chains. They offered him freedom. All he had to do was whisper a single lie. He refused. This is the story of Giordano Bruno, who looked into the infinite universe and paid for that terrifying truth with his life. What is the real cost of freedom when the fire is already lit? Watch all the way to the end. There's so much valuable info waiting for you. Don't forget to subscribe, tap like, and share this video. Every bit of support helps our channel grow and inspires us to make even better videos for you. The year is 1591. The air in Venice is thick with the scent of salt water and fading glory. It is a city of canals and shadows, a perfect place for a man who has spent 2 decades running from his past. That man was Giordano Bruno. He was not called Giordano then, at least not to the people who mattered. He used another name, a careful shield against the long memory of the Roman Inquisition. After all, he was a former Dominican friar who had dared to say the universe was endless, that the earth was just one of many worlds, and that the teachings of the church were incomplete. Such thoughts were not just heresy. They were an act of war against the established order. Bruno, born Filippo in a small town near Naples, had always been too bright for his own good. His memory was legendary. As a young man, he had dazzled Pope Pius V with his ability to recall and organize vast amounts of information, a mental skill he had honed into an art form. But his intellectual curiosity was a hunger that could not be satisfied by scripture alone. He devoured forbidden texts, he studied Copernicus, and he looked up at the night sky and saw infinity, not just the neat, small box the church described. This brilliance made him a wanted man across Europe, but it also drew the attention of the powerful. In 1591, a wealthy young Venetian noble named Giovanni Mocenigo invited Bruno to Venice. Mocenigo claimed he wanted to learn Bruno's famous memory techniques, the art of memory, and needed a great mind to be his tutor. For Bruno, who was always running low on funds and desperate for a stable place to work, this invitation felt like a gift from fate. It was a chance to settle, to write, and perhaps even to find a powerful protector in the free-spirited Republic of Venice. He arrived full of cautious hope. Mocenigo installed him in his palace, a beautiful building of cold marble and heavy silence. Bruno began his work, teaching Mocenigo the intricate methods of constructing memory palaces, mental landscapes where knowledge could be stored and retrieved instantly. But as the months passed, the relationship turned sour. Mocenigo, perhaps frustrated by the rigorous discipline required, or perhaps motivated by a deep-seated meanness, grew resentful of the older, smarter philosopher living in his house. He began to see Bruno not as a teacher, but as a dangerous, arrogant foreign guest. The bitterness curdled into something far more sinister. Mocenigo knew the true power he held over Bruno, the power of betrayal. He held the key to the philosopher's past, and he knew that Rome would pay a high price for a heretic like Bruno. On a dark evening in May 1592, the trap was sprung. Mocenigo penned a letter to the Venetian Inquisition, a venomous document detailing Bruno's heretical statements, his doubts about the divinity of Christ, and his praise for forbidden thinkers. He delivered Bruno, a man he had called his friend and teacher, straight into the hands of the Holy Office. The moment the soldiers of the Inquisition crossed the threshold of the palace, Bruno knew his luck had run out. The long, desperate race across Europe was over. He was finally caught. The city that promised him refuge had become his cage. The cells of the Venetian Inquisition were nothing like the grand, sunlit marble halls Bruno had just left. They were wet, cold tombs carved into the foundation of a monastery. The air smelled of mold, fear, and damp stone. When the guards threw Bruno into his first cell, the sound of the heavy wooden door slamming shut was the loudest noise he had ever heard. It wasn't just the noise of imprisonment. It was the sound of a vast, infinite universe suddenly shrinking down to a few feet of miserable space. The initial interrogations were relentless. The inquisitors in Venice were not immediately seeking blood. They were seeking submission. Their goal was to make Bruno recant, to simply state that his ideas were wrong and that the Church's truth was the only truth. If he did this, they could claim victory, and his punishment might be softened to lifelong imprisonment or a public penance. Bruno, however, was a master of words, a gladiator of the mind. He knew how to argue, how to spin a web of logic, and how to confuse his opponents. When asked why he taught that the universe was infinite, he didn't immediately launch into complex astronomy. Instead, he argued that an all-powerful God would naturally create an infinite creation. To suggest that God's power was limited by a small, finite universe, he argued, was an insult to God himself. The Venetian inquisitors were taken aback. They were used to dealing with simple, uneducated heretics, not philosophers who could use their own theology against them. For a time, Bruno managed to maintain a difficult balance. He admitted that some of his philosophical ideas were perhaps too advanced for common people. He expressed regret for running away from his vows. He even offered to correct some of his more extreme statements, but only those relating to theology, the study of religion. He drew a clear line in the sand. He would apologize for religious errors, but he would never apologize for his scientific and philosophical truths. "My lords," he would say, his voice echoing in the chamber, "I speak of the stars and the structure of the cosmos. These are matters of reason and sight, not matters of faith. You ask me to deny what my own eyes have shown me." This intellectual toughness became a major problem for the Venetian tribunal. They found themselves facing a man who was brilliant, frustrating, and incredibly stubborn. Some of the Venetian nobles on the tribunal, who were generally more pragmatic and less fanatical than their Roman counterparts, actually began to argue for leniency. Venice was known for its political independence, and they disliked the idea of Rome dictating justice to them. They suggested that Bruno be kept in Venice, perhaps given a light sentence. But the moment of hope was fleeting. Back in Rome, the most powerful man in the Roman Inquisition, Cardinal Bellarmine, a fierce defender of Catholic doctrine, was watching closely. Bellarmine knew that Bruno was not just another heretic. He was a symbol. His ideas, the moving earth, the countless worlds, threatened to tear the entire tapestry of accepted knowledge. Bellarmine demanded Bruno. The message was clear. Rome must deal with this man. The political pressure on Venice became enormous. A silent, invisible chain slowly tightening around the Republic's neck. Despite their pride, the Venetians eventually gave in. The truth was, they were afraid of him, too. They wanted the problem of Giordano Bruno far away from their city. In a quiet ceremony, the Venetian authorities formally handed Bruno over to the Roman delegates. The philosopher was loaded onto a ship, sailing away from the brief, false freedom of Venice and heading toward the eternal, unforgiving authority of the Vatican. His 8-year ordeal of chains and stone had just begun its darkest chapter. The journey from Venice to Rome was a nightmare of seasickness, humiliation, and the constant clatter of the chains that bound his hands and feet. But nothing could have prepared Bruno for the sheer, suffocating authority of the Roman Inquisition. The city of Rome was not just a place. It was the seat of dogma, and its prisons, particularly the ones at the Palazzo del Sant'Efisio, were designed to break the will entirely. When Bruno arrived, he was immediately placed under the strictest confinement. The Venetian ordeal had been intellectual sparring. The Roman one was psychological warfare. The key figure now was Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine was not a cruel man for the sake of it, but he was a man utterly convinced that he was defending the eternal truth of God. He viewed Bruno's ideas as a plague, and he was determined to find a cure: recantation. The Inquisition did not rush the process. They had all the time in the world, and Bruno had nowhere to go. His imprisonment stretched not for weeks or months, but for 8 agonizing years, from 1592 to 1600. In the cold, damp cells, the inquisitors used a technique designed to slowly erode the prisoner's soul. They didn't just torture him physically, though that threat always hung in the air. They tortured him with isolation, endless repetition, and hope. Every few months, Bruno would be dragged before the tribunal. The same questions would be asked. Do you believe in the divinity of Christ? Do you renounce the idea of infinite worlds? Will you swear that the sun revolves around the earth? Bruno, exhausted and weakened, would try to negotiate. He would attempt to explain that his concept of infinite worlds was a philosophical idea, not a religious one. He would argue that the Bible was a guide for salvation, not a science textbook. He was, in his mind, trying to save both himself and the truth. And for 8 years, the Inquisition played a cruel game with him. They would present him with a list of propositions, statements they demanded he reject. Sometimes, he would agree to renounce certain theological points that were minor in his mind, things he had written in anger or frustration years ago. Each time he showed a flicker of willingness to bend, the inquisitors would become gentle. They would offer him better food, a less harsh cell, and the promise of a peaceful life in a monastery if he would just sign the full recantation. They dangled freedom like a piece of bread to a starving man. But then, when he was just about to sign, he would reach the core demand, denying that the earth moved or denying that the stars were distant suns. At that line, Bruno would always stop. He would look at the document, his hand shaking, and realize that signing it meant he would live as a lie. It meant destroying the entire body of thought that had defined his life. "I cannot," he would whisper, the refusal shattering the fragile truce. "I cannot deny the truth." And the moment the refusal was uttered, the kindness would vanish. The faces of the cardinals would harden. The ink on the document would remain dry, and Bruno would be dragged back to his cell, the silence of the black walls his only companion for another long, miserable stretch. This cycle of hope and despair was the true torture. A slow, systematic attempt to convince him that his mind was the enemy and that his only escape was intellectual suicide. As the years dragged on, the Roman Inquisition realized they were facing a situation they rarely encountered: a heretic who could not be broken. Bruno's physical body was frail, but his spirit, fueled by his philosophical convictions, remained stubbornly intact. Cardinal Bellarmine finally delivered the ultimate ultimatum. In late 1599, the inquisitors presented Bruno with a final, non-negotiable list of 8 specific heretical propositions. These included the core of his beliefs: the eternity of the universe, the countless number of worlds, and the idea that Christ performed miracles not by divine power, but by occult arts, a dangerous and specific charge. Bellarmine was stern, his voice cold and unwavering. He told Bruno that there was no more room for negotiation, no more intellectual games. Either he would sign the full and complete recantation, rejecting all 8 points, or the Holy Office would be forced to proceed to the final, terrible step. This was the moment of absolute truth for Giordano Bruno. He stood before the tribunal, a man battered by 8 years of prison, facing the choice between a lie that would save his life and a truth that would end it. He thought of the infinite worlds he had dreamed of, the vast, free cosmos that existed outside these cold walls. He thought of the shame of denying his life's work, the betrayal of his own mind. He chose the light of the stars over the false safety of the earth. Bruno refused. He rejected every single point. His final refusal sealed his fate. On February 8, 1600, Giordano Bruno was led into the palace of the Inquisition to hear his final sentence. The hall was packed with stern-faced cardinals and theologians. The atmosphere was heavy, a thick blanket of official ceremony and doom. When the Inquisitor General finished reading the long, formal document, which declared Bruno an impenitent and pertinacious heretic, who must be handed over to the secular, non-church authorities for punishment, there was a chilling silence. It was tradition for the condemned man to beg for mercy, to weep, or to show some sign of remorse. But Bruno did none of these things. He stood straight, his eyes blazing with a defiant fire that seemed to mock the flickering candles in the room. He spoke only a single legendary line, directed not at the guards, but at the very men who had judged him. Perhaps your fear in pronouncing my sentence is greater than mine in receiving it. It was a staggering statement. He called them out, naming their terror of his ideas, their fear that his truth might crack the foundations of their power. He knew that by killing him, they were not destroying his ideas. They were turning them into a martyr's banner. His words were a final, brilliant act of intellectual warfare, a declaration that even their ultimate power, the power of death, could not conquer the power of a single revolutionary thought. The sentence was final: death by fire. After the terrifying words of the verdict, death by fire, Giordano Bruno was taken to the final holding place for the condemned. The days leading up to his execution were a psychological pressure cooker, designed not just to punish him, but to serve one final purpose for the Church: to force a public conversion. The Inquisitors believed that even at the very last moment, a broken heretic begging for forgiveness was a far greater victory than a silent martyr. Therefore, during his final week, the efforts to break him intensified. Priests and monks, skilled in persuasion and religious argument, were sent to his cell almost constantly. They spoke not of law or philosophy, but of salvation. They described the physical torment awaiting him, the burning, the unbearable pain, and contrasted it with the promised mercy of God if he would only make a sign of repentance. They painted vivid pictures of hell, warning him that his pride was leading his soul straight to eternal damnation. Bruno listened, but his resolve remained steel. He was not a man who feared damnation in the traditional sense. He believed his search for truth was its own form of piety. He saw the universe as a vast, living, divine entity, and he found comfort in his contemplation of the endless cosmos. He knew that even if his body was destroyed, his ideas, the stars he had named and the worlds he had imagined, would continue to exist. He spent his final nights in a strange state of quiet peace, writing what he could, or simply gazing at the small patch of sky visible through his window, the same stars he had spent his life studying, now his only witnesses. The chosen day for the execution was February 17, 1600. It was a cold, Roman morning, the air crisp and unforgiving. The location was the Campo de Fiori, the Field of Flowers, a busy public square used for markets, celebrations, and, today, a spectacle of terrifying justice. The procession began early. Bruno was marched through the streets of Rome. He was stripped of all symbols of his former life. No monk's robe, no sign of his scholarly achievements. He was forced to wear a humiliating garment that made him look ridiculous, designed to further degrade him in the eyes of the public. As he was led past the massive stone buildings and bustling crowds, the atmosphere was a mix of religious fervor and morbid curiosity. The crowds had gathered not just to see the execution, but to be reassured that the boundaries of their world were safe, that the earth was indeed the center of all things, and that the men in power were correct. The execution spot was ready. A tall stake had been planted in the center of the square, surrounded by a massive pile of firewood and kindling. As Bruno was tied to the stake, one final act of desperation was attempted by the church. A crucifix, the symbol of Christian mercy and suffering, was thrust toward his face, a last chance to kiss it, to acknowledge the church's authority, and to save his soul from its immediate, final judgment. Bruno did the unthinkable. He turned his head away. He refused the final comfort, the final acknowledgement of their power. He was not rejecting Christ. He was rejecting the institution that was about to burn him alive for seeking truth. It was his final, silent, and most powerful act of rebellion. The philosopher was ready to die, not in fear, but in profound, terrifying defiance. The Campo de Fiori fell into a hushed silence, broken only by the rough sounds of the wood being piled higher around the philosopher's legs. Bruno was bound securely to the stake. His refusal of the crucifix had sent a gasp through the crowd, confirming to everyone that this was no ordinary criminal, but a true, hardened heretic. The moment had arrived. The executioner, acting on the command of the secular authorities, stepped forward. A torch, already lit and spitting sparks, was lowered to the dry wood at the base of the pyre. The flames caught quickly, licking greedily at the kindling. Smoke immediately billowed upward, mixing with the cold morning air, a black column rising toward the Roman sky. The heat soon became intense, forcing the closest members of the crowd to step back. Giordano Bruno did not cry out. He stood tall within the rising wall of fire and smoke. His body was being consumed, but his mind remained focused, a final beacon of defiance against the oppressive world that sought to silence him. He must have been thinking of the worlds he had described, worlds that were free from the confines of human dogma, worlds that rotated and spun in an endless, empty space. He died gazing upward, into the infinite space he had always championed. The fire did its gruesome work, and soon, the brilliant mind that had journeyed to the stars was reduced to ashes and a lingering, acrid smell in the square. The men of the Inquisition had succeeded in killing the man, Filippo Bruno, who dared to think too freely. But they failed completely in their ultimate goal, to erase his ideas. The very act of his execution backfired dramatically. The image of the defiant philosopher, choosing fire over falsehood, was not forgotten. It was whispered in coffee houses, discussed in secret scholarly circles, and preserved in the memories of those who craved intellectual freedom. Bruno's sacrifice became a seed for the future. Just a few years later, his ideas about the cosmos began to circulate again. Though he was still officially condemned, other thinkers like Johannes Kepler and, crucially, Galileo Galilei would later pick up the thread of his revolutionary cosmology. Bruno had not invented the idea that the Earth moved, but he was the first man in the modern era to be burned alive for passionately advocating for a universe of infinite scope, where the stars were other suns and there might be countless other worlds. He wasn't just defending a scientific theory. He was defending the freedom of inquiry itself, the right of the human mind to explore, question, and discover, regardless of what authority commanded. For centuries, his story remained a quiet, painful memory, but in the 19th century, as the age of science flourished, his image was fully restored. He became a powerful symbol of the conflict between religious faith and scientific reason. Today, in the very square where he was burned alive, the Campo de Fiori, a bronze statue of Giordano Bruno stands facing the Vatican. He is cloaked in his friar's robes, his face shadowed, his posture proud and unyielding. The statue was erected in 1889, a direct challenge to the authority that condemned him. Giordano Bruno died believing that a single, terrible act of violence could not silence an idea whose time had come. He was right,